Out here, a man can see for 30 miles. People think that is a comfort. It is the opposite, because on the night I am going to tell you about, I watched a thing pace my truck across open desert for 9 miles. First in my headlights, then off to the side, then in my mirrors, running, upright, keeping even with me on a washboard dirt road while my speedometer sat at 50, across flat empty country where there was nowhere it could have come from, and nowhere on this earth it could hide. That is the part the postcards do not tell you about the desert. In the forest, the thing is on you before you know it. Out here, you see it coming for a long, long time. You watch it close the distance under a sky full of stars. And there is not one thing you can do but keep both hands on the wheel and pray the engine does not quit. I am a ranger in the high desert of northern Arizona. I have given 14 years to that country and I love it like nothing else. But there is a road out past the mesas that I will not drive after the sun goes down, not for any reason. And by the end of this you are going to understand why. Let me handle the small business quick, because this is not a story I like to sit inside of any longer than I have to. If you want to ride along on the next one, subscribe to the channel and switch on that notification bell, so you are in the truck with me the next time I take a call I should have passed on. And tapping that like button does more than you would guess. It is the quiet thing that decides whether an account like this one ever crosses the desert to the next person who needs to hear it. And do me one kindness in the comments. Put down where you are tonight, your town and your country, and the hour your clock shows as you listen. I like knowing how far a story travels under one night sky, and how many of us are sitting up in the quiet together while everyone else sleeps easy. That is all of it. Now climb in, and pull your door shut, because we have got some country to cross before this gets bad. You have to understand the high desert before any of this will land right, because it is nothing like the desert people picture, and it is nothing like the forests where the rest of these things happen, and the rules out here are its own. This is not the desert of tall green cactus and sand dunes. This is high country, 4,000 and 5,000 feet up, a vast tableland of red and gray earth broken by flat-topped mesas and cut by sandy washes that run a few times a year and lie bone dry the rest. It grows juniper and pinyon pine, low and twisted and silver sage, and not much else, spaced wide apart so that you can see across the land for miles and miles, to the next mesa, to the blue ghost of mountains a day's drive off. By day in summer it is an oven, 110 in the shade if there were any shade, and the heat shimmers up off the ground and makes the distance swim, and at night it drops cold, cold enough to kill a stranded man even in July, and the sky comes out so thick with stars that the band of the Milky Way throws a shadow, and the country goes silver and still, and enormous and silent in a way that has to be felt to be understood. My name is Holt. I have worked this desert district for 14 years. A huge spread of federal land, monument and wilderness, and the dirt road country between, out past the last paved road and the last power line, where almost nobody goes. I grew up in the Southwest, in a town that does not matter to this, and after some hard years in places with too many people, I came out to the emptiest country I could find work in, and the bigness of it suited me, and I stayed. The job is mostly solitude and distance. I patrol the dirt roads and the washes in a truck. I check on the few backcountry permits. I watch for people who take more from the land than the law allows. I keep an eye on the scatter of old ranches and the handful of stubborn folks who still live out past the pavement. And when somebody does not come back from the desert, I am one of the few who can go look, because most people get lost out here just trying to find the people who are lost. Search and rescue in this country is a race against the heat and the cold and the size of the land. A person off their route out here, with no water, in that sun, has hours, not days. We find most of them, the honest cases, by the simple, cruel arithmetic of the desert. They walk for water that is not there, and they go down in a wash or under a juniper, and we find them, or the buzzards show us where. I had made my peace with that kind of loss the way you do. The desert kills clean and it kills honest, most of the time. Most of the time. There was a stretch of country out past the far mesas, along a particular dirt road where the losses did not feel clean or honest, where people went out and were never found at all, not a body, not a pack, not a track, and where the few folks who lived nearest that road would not talk about it. and that not talking was the loudest thing in this whole story, and I was too slow to hear it. The nearest thing to a town in my district was a single gas station and trading post out at the highway junction, the last fuel for 90 miles in any direction, run by a man named Raymond Yazzie. Raymond was Dene Navajo, and his family had been in that country since long before there was a road or a flag or a ranger, and he was a calm, decent, careful man who knew that desert in a way I never would. We were friendly across the years, in the way of two men who are the only two for 100 miles. I tell you about Raymond because of the way he went quiet, the one time the subject came near him, and because that quiet was a warning I should have weighed and did not. In the middle of one June, a man went missing out past the far mesas. His name was Gil Brantley, a contract worker, mid-40s, out doing survey work on the federal land. Driving the back roads alone in a government truck, checking markers. He was supposed to check in by radio every evening. One evening he did not. His truck was found the next day by another worker, parked on the shoulder of that far dirt road, out past the mesas. Doors shut, keys in it, his water and his hat and his gear all still inside, and Gil Brantley gone, with no track leading away that anyone could find, into open country where a man cannot hide and cannot walk far and cannot vanish. And it fell to me, because it was my district, to go out to that road and find out what had happened to him. The evening before I drove out, I stopped at Raymond Yazzie's for fuel, and to tell him where I was headed, the way you do out there, so somebody knows. I told him a survey man had gone missing on the far road past the mesas, and that I was going out in the morning to work it. Raymond was filling my cans, and when I said which road, his hands went still on the pump. Just for a second. Then he finished, and he capped the cans, and he did not look at me the way he usually did. He said, "Quiet. You go out there in the morning, you do your looking in the daylight, and you be back on this highway before the sun is down." I asked him why. Raymond Yazzie looked at me then, a long steady look, and he said, "Because there are things out on that road that are not my business to talk about, and not yours to go looking for. And the only thing I will tell you, because I would tell any man, is that whatever you find out there, you do not let the night catch you on that road. You hear me, Holt, be off it by sundown." And that was all. He would not say one word more. I tried, gently, the way you do, and he simply changed the subject and rang up my fuel, and I have known a lot of men go quiet in my life, but I never saw a man close a door inside himself, the way Raymond Yazzie closed one that evening. And I drove home with his quiet sitting on me heavier than any words could have. I want to be honest. I did not heed it the way I should have. I told myself Raymond was a careful man, that the old families out here carried old beliefs, that there were things they did not discuss out of respect and superstition both, and that none of that changed the fact that a man was missing on my ground. So at first light I loaded my truck with extra water and fuel, and I drove out past the mesas, alone, onto that far road, to find Gil Brantley, and I told myself I would be off it by sundown, and I almost was. Almost. It is a long drive out to that country. 2 hours of dirt road past the last ranch, the mesa standing up red and flat against a hard blue sky. The heat already building by mid-morning. The land getting emptier and stiller the farther out I went, until there was nothing but the road and the sage and the wide silver silence. And the only moving thing in all that country was my own dust trail hanging behind me in the still air. I found Gil Brantley's truck where it had been left, on the shoulder of the road out past the farthest mesa. It had been towed nowhere because there was nowhere to tow it to. The county had photographed it and left it. I went over it, and it told the same wrong story everyone had said it told. Doors shut, keys in the ignition, his full water jug on the seat, his hat, his clipboard, his lunch, everything a man needs and would never walk off into that country without. And Gil Brantley simply gone, out of a truck stopped in the middle of open desert, with no sign of why he had stopped and no track of where he had gone. I cast for sign all around it, in widening circles, for the better part of an hour, and that is when the first thing came that I could not explain. And I am a good tracker, and I have read that ground my whole career. There were tracks near the truck, off the shoulder, in the soft sand of the borrow ditch. They were canine, like a big coyote or a dog, except there are no dogs out there, and these were too big for any coyote that has ever lived, and that was not even the part that stopped me. The part that stopped me was that the tracks changed. For a stretch they ran on 4 feet, a loping canine gait, and then in the space of 2 or 3 strides they rose up and ran on two long hind feet, the prints deeper, the stride lengthening, the toes splaying, and they ran upright away from the truck, out across the open desert, in a straight line, toward the far wash, and I crouched over the place where 4 legs became 2, and I felt the bottom drop out of everything I thought I knew about that country. A coyote does not stand up. Nothing out there stands up and runs on 2 legs across the open ground. But the sand said it had, plain as print, and the sand does not lie any more than the snow does. I followed those upright tracks out across the desert, on foot, away from the road, toward the wash, calling Gil Brantley's name into that enormous silence, and the sun climbed and the heat came down like a weight, and the tracks ran straight and true for the better part of a mile and then dropped into the dry wash and, on the hard-packed floor of it, were simply gone. The way they had been gone for everyone who looked for Gil Brantley, the way the desert closes over a thing like heat shimmer over the road. I stood in that wash in the hammering sun, and I called his name, and the silence ate it, and I had the first true sense, standing there, that I was not alone, that something in that empty country had its attention on me, a feeling I knew well from 14 years of solitude and that had never once been wrong. I worked that country the rest of the day and found no more of Gil Brantley. And as the afternoon wore on, I will tell you that I felt watched the entire time, a steady pressure between my shoulder blades, and more than once, far off across the open desert, at the limit of sight, I thought I saw something standing on the rim of the wash or the shoulder of a low rise, upright, still, watching me. And when I turned my glasses on it, there was only sage and a juniper and the shimmer, and I told myself it was the heat and my own nerves, and I did not fully believe it. The light was getting long and gold when I made the decision that I have turned over more nights than I can count. The right call, the one Raymond Yazzie had near begged me to make, was to break off and drive for the highway right then, with daylight and miles to spare, and come back with a county team in the morning. I had found Gil Brantley's tracks. The procedure was satisfied, but I had also found tracks that rose up and ran on 2 legs, and I had a survey man unaccounted for. And there was one more place I wanted to check before I lost the light, an old line shack I knew. A falling down cattle shack a few miles out a sidetrack, the only structure in all that country, the kind of place a hurt or lost man might crawl to for shade. I told myself it would take 20 minutes. I told myself I would still beat the sun to the highway. I drove out the side track to the shack, and I was wrong about the sun, and I was wrong about a great deal more than that. The line shack sat at the foot of a low mesa, gray and sagging, half its roof gone, and the moment I stepped out of the truck I smelled it, and the smell was the second thing I could not explain. It was rank, and animal, and wrong, a wet musk like a wet dog, and rotten meat, and something under it that I have no word for. And it hung in and around that shack in the still evening air with no breeze to carry it. And every part of me that had spent 14 years alone in wild country locked up and said leave. I should have. Instead, I made myself walk to the doorway of that shack and look in, because there was a chance Gil Brantley was in there. And that is the job, and what I saw inside is a thing I have never put in any report and am only telling now. It was not a body. It was worse in a way, because a body I could have understood. The dirt floor of that shack had things arranged on it. Bones, animal bones, coyote and rabbit, and the long bones of cattle, laid out in patterns, deliberate, careful, in lines and spirals that no animal makes and no weather makes, and among them, set in with the same terrible care, were a few things that did not belong to any animal: a boot, a wristwatch, its band stiff and dark, a government clipboard, warped and stained, and I did not have to read the name on it to know whose it was. Gil Brantley had been here, or what was left of him had been brought here, and arranged, made part of whatever that floor was. And I stood in that doorway with the rank smell filling my throat, and I understood, all at once and far too late, that Raymond Yazzie had not been superstitious, that he had been trying to keep me alive, and that the sun was now touching the rim of the far mesas, and that I was a long way out a side track on a road no one would drive at night. Alone, with the light going. I want to stop us right here, at the worst moment, before I get in that truck and try to drive out, Because once the engine turns over, this does not let up until the highway. So let me say it to you straight, the way I wish someone had said it to me before I ever drove out past those mesas. I can tell this has its hold on you now, that you are out there in that doorway with me in the failing light. And I can tell, because I have done this a while, that you still have not tapped that like button or left a single word below to mark that you were here in the truck with me tonight. That is the small, safe, costless thing, the wise thing, done from somewhere nothing can reach you. So do it now, the like and a quick word, while the engine is still off and the worst is still ahead. I did not do the small wise thing in time. You can. Then climb in and brace yourself, because here is where the drive begins. I got into my truck and I locked the doors, which I had never once done in 14 years in that country, and my hands were not steady. And I started the engine and I turned around in the yard of that shack and I drove back out the side track toward the main road. And the last of the sun went down behind the mesas, and the long blue dusk came over that desert. And that is when it came out into the open and showed itself, because it was done hiding. I caught the first movement off to my right, out across the open ground, keeping pace with the truck. At first my mind tried to make it a coyote running parallel, the way they sometimes do. And then it rose up, the way the tracks had risen up, and it ran on two legs upright, out there in the blue dusk, matching my speed across open desert. And I was doing 30 on that washboard track, and it was keeping even with me without effort. A tall, lean, wrong shape, low-headed. Its arms working, running the way nothing that runs upright should be able to run, smooth and fast and tireless, pacing me across the flat. I reached the main road, and I turned onto it toward the highway. 90 miles of dirt between me and the pavement. And I put my foot down. 40. 50. The truck banging and sliding on the washboard. The dust boiling up red in my mirrors in the last light, and the thing came with me. It crossed behind the truck through my own dust, and came up on the left, and it was closer now, near enough in the dusk that I could see it was the gray tan of a coyote's coat but stretched over a frame that was all wrong, too long in the limb, the joints bending in ways that turned my stomach, and its head, when it turned it toward the truck as it ran, was a coyote's head and not a coyote's head. The muzzle too short, the eyes too large and too forward and catching my headlights with a flat shine that no animal's eyes throw. And it looked at me, running 50 miles an hour alongside my truck on a desert road. It looked right in at me through the window with those wrong shining eyes. And I have never in my life known a fear like the fear of being looked at by that thing while it ran. I drove. There was nothing else to do. The land was open for 30 miles in every direction. No town, no house, no other soul, just the one road and the dust and the stars coming out hard overhead, and that thing pacing my truck mile after mile, falling back, surging up, crossing from one side to the other through my dust, hurting me, playing with me, the way the others in these stories were hurted and played with. And I understood that it was faster than my truck, that it was letting me drive, that it could end this whenever it chose and was choosing not to, and that understanding was almost worse than dying. It tried the windows. Twice it came in close on the driver's side, and I felt more than heard something rake along the door. A long scraping drag down the metal, and once it came up so close that its wrong shining face was right at the glass keeping pace at 50 miles an hour, and it opened its mouth. And over the roar of the engine and the road I heard it make a sound, and the sound was the third thing I cannot explain, and I am only going to tell it once. It said my name in a man's voice, in Gil Brantley's voice, I think, though I never heard the man speak in life, a survey man's flat ordinary voice saying, "Halt, halt, pull over," right against the glass while the truck shook at 50 on the washboard, and I did not look at it again after that. And I did not slow down, and I did not answer, and I drove that 90 miles of dirt with both hands locked white on the wheel and my eyes straight ahead and tears running down my face and that thing running alongside in the starlight calling me by a dead man's name. I do not know at what point it left me. Somewhere in the last stretch, as the glow of the highway came up faint on the horizon, the pacing fell back, and the dust in my mirrors held nothing but dust. And when I finally hit the pavement of the highway and the tires bit smooth asphalt, and I turned toward Raymond Yazi's distant lights, there was nothing behind me but the empty road and the enormous starry country, silver and still and innocent, as if none of it had happened, as if the desert had simply closed back over the whole thing like heat shimmer over the road. I drove to Raymond's gas station with the engine screaming, and I pulled in under his lights, and I sat there shaking and could not make my hands let go of the wheel. Raymond Yazzie came out. He took one look at my truck, at the long raking scrapes down the driver's door, at my face through the glass, and he did not ask me one single question. He just stood there a moment in the light of his station, and then he nodded, slowly, the way Joe Tritt nodded up in the Arctic and Mose nodded in the rainforest, and every one of these careful old keepers of hard country nods at the man who has finally seen the thing they tried to warn him about. And he said only, "You got off the road." It was not a question. And I said, "Yes, Raymond, I got off the road." And he said, "Good. Then you do not go back on it. Not in the day, not in the night, not ever, you hear me? Some country is not ours, Holt, and that road runs through some of it, and the kindest thing it ever did for any man was let you drive out tonight." And that was all he would say, and he would not say even that much again. And I have respected his silence ever since, and I understand it now as the deepest kind of knowing. The kind that has kept his people alive in that country for 10,000 years, which is the knowing of what not to look at, and what not to name, and what roads not to drive. We never found Gil Brantley. Not really. I told the county where the line shack was, and a team went out, in numbers, in daylight, the way you have to, and they found the shack, and they found enough in it to close the case, and they wrote it the way it had to be written, which was that survey worker Gil Brantley had died in the desert of misadventure, exposure, lost from his vehicle, remains recovered, animal disturbance at the site, case closed. A man dying in that desert and his remains scattered by animals is a thing the world believes, because the world wants to believe it, and the alternative is not a thing a county report can hold. I did not tell them about the bones laid out in patterns, or the rank smell with no wind, or the thing that paced my truck for 90 miles, or the dead man's voice at my window. There was nowhere to write it. I signed what they put in front of me, and I have signed others since, because that road keeps its quiet tally, and they are always exposure, always misadventure, always the desert, and the desert never says one word. I left that work the following spring. 14 years and I left it, and the people I worked with thought I had lost my nerve, and let them think it. The truth is the road. I could not keep a district that had that road in it. I could not keep driving out past those mesas knowing what ran the open country out there after the sun went down. I asked for a transfer, and I took a posting in another state, in a green and crowded and ordinary place with towns close together and lights all night and a horizon you can reach out and touch. And most days I am glad of it, and some days I miss the big silver desert silence so badly it is like grief, because I did love that country, before it showed me the thing that lives in the empty part of it. Here is the part I have never put in a report, and it is not the kind of part you might expect, because this thing did not follow me home the way the others followed the men in their stories. It stayed out there. It belongs out there. That road is its road, and that country is its country, and it had no need of me once I was off its ground. What it left me with is smaller than that, and in its way worse, because it is with me all the time. I cannot drive an empty road at night anymore. Anywhere. Not the green ordinary country I live in now. Not a back lane. Not a stretch of dark highway with no other cars. The moment the lights of other people fall away and it is just my headlights and the night and the open shoulder running past, my hands lock up on the wheel, and my heart starts going, and my eyes start cutting to the edges of the light, to the ditch, to the dark beyond the dark, looking for a tall, lean shape that has risen up off 4 legs and started to pace me, and I have to pull over, or turn back, or call someone just to hear a human voice. And I have learned to plan my whole life so that I am never ever alone on an empty road after the sun goes down. My family does not fully understand it. I have never told them why. I have told them I do not like driving at night, which is true, and is a fraction of the truth, and that fraction is the size of a whole desert and a road I will not name, and a thing that ran beside my truck for 90 miles calling me by a dead man's voice. So if you take one thing from a tired old desert hand tonight, take this. If you are ever out in some great empty country, far from the lights of other people, on a long road with the land open and flat for miles, and you see something off to the side keeping pace with you, and you tell yourself it is a coyote, a dog, a trick of your tired eyes, and then you watch it rise up and run on two legs and start to close the distance. Then you must understand that there is nothing you can do that will be enough except the one thing, which is to keep driving, and keep your eyes ahead, and do not slow down, and do not look at it, and above all, no matter whose voice it uses, no matter how it calls you, do not answer, and do not ever, for any reason, pull over. And when you reach the lights, and it falls back, and the road behind you is only road again, you do the thing that Raymond Yazzie spent his quiet wisdom trying to teach me before I was wise enough to hear it. You do not go back, not in the day, and not in the night, and not ever. Some country is not ours. It never was. And the kindest thing it will ever do for you is let you drive out the one time, and the only fools who get a second warning are the ones who do not take the first. I took mine. Late, but I took it. That is the whole reason I am here to tell you. Take yours sooner than I took mine, and stay off the empty roads after dark. "12 years ago, when I was just 9 years old, I lived next door to my best friend Ryan. Our families had been neighbors since before either of us was born, creating a bond that felt more like brotherhood than friendship. Ryan's family owned a remote cabin nestled deep in what we called the mountains, though they were really just heavily forested hills about 3 hours from our suburban home. Every winter, Ryan's family would pack up their old station wagon and disappear for a week into those woods. I'd watch from my bedroom window as they loaded sleeping bags, coolers, and enough supplies to last them through their annual retreat. The way Ryan described it made it sound like paradise. No phones, no internet. Just the four of us surrounded by pristine wilderness. That November, Ryan's mother, Patricia, knocked on our front door with an invitation that would change everything. "We'd love to have him join us this year," she told my parents, her breath visible in the cold air. "Ryan's been asking for months, and we think the boys are old enough now." My parents exchanged glances. At 9, I'd never spent a week away from home, let alone in some remote cabin. But something about the way Patricia's eyes lit up when she talked about their special place convinced them. Within days, my small duffel bag was packed with warm clothes, books, and enough snacks to survive a small apocalypse. The morning of departure arrived gray and overcast, with the promise of snow hanging heavy in the air. I hugged my parents goodbye, my stomach churning with excitement and nervousness. Ryan bounced in the back seat as his father, Dennis, loaded our bags into the rear of their station wagon. "You boys ready for an adventure?" Dennis asked, his voice carrying that forced enthusiasm adults use when they're trying to make something sound more exciting than it probably is. The drive stretched endlessly before us. Ryan and I spent the first hour playing word games and sharing stories, but as we left the suburbs behind and entered increasingly desolate countryside, our conversation gradually died away. The landscape outside grew more primitive with each passing mile. Farmhouses gave way to trailer homes, then to nothing but endless stretches of bare trees reaching toward the leaden sky like skeletal fingers. Somewhere during the second hour, both Ryan and I fell asleep. I remember dreaming about something chasing me through dark woods, my feet slipping on wet leaves as branches tore at my clothes. The dream felt so real that when Dennis finally called our names, I woke with a start, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Wake up, boys. We're here." The first thing I noticed was the silence. After hours of road noise and engine hum, the sudden quiet felt oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see we'd stopped in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and bare hardwood trees. Fresh snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket, undisturbed except for the tire tracks we'd just made. The cabin squatted in the center of the clearing like something from a nightmare. It was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, constructed from dark logs that had weathered to an almost black patina. 5 windows punctuated its walls, but they were so grimy and dark that they looked more like empty eye sockets than openings to let in light. "Isn't it beautiful?" Patricia said, but her voice carried an odd note that made me glance at her face. She was staring at the cabin with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between affection and apprehension. Ryan and I tumbled out of the car, our breath immediately visible in the frigid air. The snow crunched under our feet with that particular sound that only comes with temperatures well below freezing. I noticed that our footprints were the only marks disturbing the perfect white surface around the cabin. "How long since anyone's been here?" I asked Dennis as he wrestled a cooler from the back of the wagon. "Oh, about 6 months," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "We came up for a weekend in May, but the weather was too warm for our liking." Something about his answer felt incomplete, but before I could ask more questions, Ryan grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the cabin. "Come on! Wait until you see inside!" The front door was painted a deep red that looked almost black in the dim light filtering through the clouds. Dennis had to force it open, the hinges screaming in protest, as if the cabin itself was reluctant to let us enter. The sound echoed through the surrounding trees, and I could have sworn I heard something echo back from the forest depths. Inside, the cabin was even smaller than it appeared from outside. The main room combined kitchen, dining area, and living space into a cramped rectangle dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb what little light managed to penetrate the dirty windows. Everything smelled of must, old wood, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. "The electricity's been acting up lately," Dennis explained as Patricia tried unsuccessfully to turn on a lamp. "Good thing we brought plenty of candles and flashlights." Ryan and I dropped our bags and immediately began exploring. There were 2 bedrooms, one for his parents and one for us, plus a tiny bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Our room contained 2 narrow beds, a closet with a door that wouldn't stay closed, and one of the cabin's 5 windows. "This is going to be awesome," Ryan said, flopping down on one of the beds. But as I looked around the room, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. As evening approached, the temperature dropped even further. Dennis built a fire in the stone fireplace, and we gathered around it for dinner. Canned soup heated on a camp stove, since the cabin's electric range wasn't working. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating shapes that seemed to move independently of the fire itself. "Tell us about the history of this place," I said, trying to make conversation as we ate. Dennis and Patricia exchanged a look that lasted just a moment too long. "It's been in Dennis's family for generations," Patricia finally said. "His great-grandfather built it back in 1932. "Has anything interesting ever happened here?" Ryan asked, sensing the same undercurrent of tension that I'd noticed. "Define interesting," Dennis replied, but his tone suggested he didn't want to pursue the topic. After dinner, we sat around the fire playing cards and telling stories. Despite the cozy scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin's windows were too dark, too empty, and every time the wind picked up outside, the building would creak and groan like it was in pain. Around 9 o'clock, just as we were getting ready to head to bed, we heard it. A sound from outside that made everyone freeze. It was a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from the forest surrounding the cabin. The sound was too deep to be human, too structured to be wind, too intelligent to be a simple animal call. "What was that?" I whispered. "Probably just a deer," Dennis said, but his voice was tight with tension. "They make all sorts of noises, especially during mating season." The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely not from a deer. It was a deliberate, almost questioning call that seemed to be probing the darkness around our small island of light and warmth. Patricia stood up abruptly. "Boys, I think it's time you got ready for bed." Ryan and I brushed our teeth in the tiny bathroom, using water from a jug since the pipes had frozen. The mirror above the sink was cracked, splitting our reflections into fractured pieces that looked wrong in the dim light from our flashlights. "Are you nervous about anything?" I asked Ryan as we walked back to our room. He shrugged, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. My parents always get weird when we come up here. I think they know something they're not telling me. Our room felt even smaller with the door closed. The single window looked out into absolute darkness. No moon, no stars, just a black void that seemed to press against the glass like something alive. Ryan and I climbed into our respective beds, but neither of us was ready for sleep. "Want to tell scary stories?" Ryan suggested, but his voice carried a forced brightness that didn't fool either of us. Instead, we lay in our beds and whispered about school, about friends, about anything except the growing sense that something was very wrong with this place. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost human. I must have dozed off sometime after midnight because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake to the sound of something striking wood. It was a sharp, deliberate sound, tap, 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 like someone knocking on the cabin's walls. My heart immediately began racing. The room was pitch black, darker than any night I'd ever experienced. The darkness felt thick, oppressive, like something I could reach out and touch. I strained my ears, trying to determine if I'd really heard something or if it had been part of a dream. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the sound was definitely coming from outside our window. I turned my head toward Ryan's bed, intending to wake him, but something made me freeze. In the absolute darkness, I could just make out his form under the covers. But there was something else. A shadow that seemed too large, too solid to be explained by the darkness alone. My hand shot out to the bedside table, fumbling for the flashlight I'd seen there earlier. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal cylinder, and I clicked it on, immediately covering the beam with my palm, so that only a small amount of light escaped between my fingers. The room looked normal. Ryan sleeping peacefully in his bed, our bags on the floor, the closet door hanging slightly open as it had been all evening. But something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, as if someone had been breathing in the room besides Ryan and me. I slowly moved the flashlight beam across the floor, and that's when I saw them. Wet footprints leading from the window to the center of the room, where they stopped at the edge of the small throw rug. The prints were clearly visible in the dim light, dark against the lighter wood of the floor. My blood felt like ice water in my veins. The footprints were too large to be mine or Ryan's, and they were still wet, as if whoever had made them had only just left. But the window was closed, and I could see the frost on the glass from the outside cold. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The flashlight beam shook as I tried to control my trembling hands. I followed the trail of wet prints with my eyes, tracing them from the window to where they disappeared at the rug's edge. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the closet. The door, which had been hanging slightly open, was now almost completely closed. But in the narrow gap between the door and the frame, I could see something that made my mouth go dry with fear. It was dark, darker than the shadows around it, and it seemed to be moving slightly, as if something was breathing behind the door. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake Ryan and his parents, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, the flashlight beam wavering between the wet footprints on the floor and the dark gap in the closet door. The scratching sound came again, followed by what sounded like a low, rumbling breath. Whatever was in the closet was alive, and it knew I was there. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I ran from the room as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't bother trying to be quiet. Terror had taken over completely. My feet slapped against the cold wooden floor as I raced down the short hallway to Dennis and Patricia's room. "Something's in our room," I gasped, bursting through their door without knocking. "There's something in the closet and there are wet footprints on the floor." Dennis sat up immediately, his hair disheveled and his eyes alert despite having been asleep moments before. "What do you mean, wet footprints?" "From the window to the middle of the room," I said, my words tumbling over each other in my haste to explain. "And there's something in the closet, something breathing." Patricia was already reaching for her robe. "Show us," she said, her voice steady, but her face pale in the dim light from Dennis's flashlight. We crept back to my room, Dennis leading the way with his bright flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Ryan was awake now, sitting up in bed with a confused expression on his face. "What's going on?" he asked. But his parents ignored him, focusing instead on the floor where I'd seen the footprints. Dennis swept his light across the wooden planks, and my heart sank. The floor was completely dry. There was no sign of the wet prints I'd seen just minutes before. No dark marks, no moisture. Nothing to indicate that anyone had walked through the room with wet feet. "I saw them," I insisted, my voice cracking with desperation. "They were right there, from the window to the rug. They were wet, like someone had walked through snow." Patricia knelt down and ran her hand across the floor where the prints had been. "It's completely dry, honey. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Dennis moved to the window and tested the latch. "Locked tight," he announced. "No way anyone could have gotten in this way." The closet door was now hanging open exactly as it had been when we'd first entered the room. Dennis shined his light inside, revealing nothing but our coats and Ryan's extra pair of boots. "But I heard something in there," I said, pointing at the closet. "Something breathing, something scratching." Dennis stepped into the closet and moved the coats aside, checking every corner. "Nothing here but spider webs and dust." I felt like I was going crazy. Everything I'd seen and heard was gone, erased as if it had never existed. But the terror I'd felt was real, and the memory of those wet footprints was burned into my mind with perfect clarity. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us in unfamiliar places," Patricia said gently, putting her arm around my shoulders. "Especially when we're tired and it's dark." "I wasn't imagining it," I said, but even to my own ears the words sounded weak and unconvincing. Dennis and Patricia exchanged another one of those looks that lasted just a moment too long. "Why don't you try to get some sleep?" Dennis suggested. "We'll leave our door open, and you can call if you need anything." They left Ryan and me alone in the room. Ryan looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Did you really see footprints?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And something was in that closet, something that didn't belong there." Ryan nodded slowly. "This place gives me the creeps too. I've never liked coming here, but my parents insist on it every year." I climbed back into bed, but I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand under the covers. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound from outside made me tense up with fear. The wet footprints might have disappeared, but whatever had made them was still out there, still watching, still waiting. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. Every time I began to drift off, I'd snap awake at the slightest sound. The wind in the trees, the cabin settling, the occasional creak of old wood. Ryan seemed to be having similar trouble, tossing and turning in his bed across the room. When morning finally arrived, pale gray light filtering through the dirty window, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Dennis was already up, moving around the main room and trying to coax life from the camp stove for breakfast. "How did you boys sleep?" Patricia asked as Ryan and I stumbled into the kitchen area. "Fine," Ryan lied, but I could see the dark circles under his eyes. "I kept hearing things," I said, determined to be honest even if the adults didn't believe me. "Sounds from outside, like someone walking around the cabin." Dennis glanced up from the stove, his expression unreadable. "What kind of sounds?" "Footsteps. And that crying sound we heard last night, but closer. Like whatever was making it was right outside our window." "The wind can make all sorts of noises when it moves through the trees," Patricia said, but she was looking at Dennis rather than at me. "And old buildings like this one are full of creaks and groans." We ate breakfast in relative silence. Instant oatmeal and coffee for the adults, hot chocolate for Ryan and me. The food tasted like cardboard, but I forced myself to eat anyway, knowing I'd need energy for whatever the day might bring. After breakfast, Dennis announced that he was going to check the generator and see if he could get the electricity working. "You boys can play outside if you want, but stay close to the cabin. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know your way around." Ryan and I bundled up in our coats and boots and headed outside. The morning was crisp and clear, with bright sunlight making the snow sparkle like diamonds. In the daylight, the cabin looked less threatening, just a small building in need of some maintenance. "Want to build a snowman?" Ryan suggested, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Instead, we found ourselves walking around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any sign of what I'd experienced the night before. The snow around the building was pristine and undisturbed. No footprints except for the ones we were making and the tire tracks from our arrival. "If someone was walking around out here, wouldn't there be tracks?" Ryan asked. It was a logical question and I didn't have a good answer. The snow looked like it had been undisturbed for hours, possibly days. But I knew what I'd seen inside the cabin, and I knew it hadn't been a dream. We spent the morning playing half-heartedly in the snow, building a lopsided snowman and having a brief snowball fight. But the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. The feeling was so strong that I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder toward the tree line, expecting to see something staring back at me. "Do you feel that?" I asked Ryan during a lull in our play. "Feel what?" "Like someone's watching us." Ryan looked around nervously. "Now that you mention it, yeah, it's like the woods have eyes." We didn't talk much after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts and fears. The day seemed to drag endlessly, and I found myself looking forward to the evening, when we could at least be inside with the doors locked and the fire burning. But as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, I realized that the approaching night brought its own terrors. Whatever had been in our room the night before would be back, and this time, I wasn't sure we'd be so lucky. I woke the next morning to the sound of frantic activity. Dennis was moving around the cabin with obvious urgency, stuffing belongings into bags and coolers. Patricia was stripping the beds and shoving linens into a large duffel bag. "What's going on?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Change of plans," Dennis said without looking at me. "We're heading home early." "Why?" Ryan asked, appearing in the doorway of our room in his pajamas. "I forgot something important back home," Dennis replied, but his explanation sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it. "Something that can't wait until we get back." Within 30 minutes, everything was packed and loaded into the station wagon. Ryan and I barely had time to get dressed before we were bundled into the back seat, still in our pajamas with our clothes stuffed into plastic bags. "Can't we at least eat breakfast first?" Ryan asked, but his parents ignored him. Dennis started the engine and backed out of the clearing with more speed than seemed safe on the snowy drive. I turned to look back at the cabin through the rear window, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move past one of the dark windows. The drive home was tense and silent. Dennis gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror as if he expected something to be following us. Patricia stared straight ahead, her jaw set in a hard line. "Did something happen?" I finally asked. "Nothing happened," Dennis said, but his voice was tight with strain. "We just need to get home." Ryan and I exchanged glances. We both knew that something had definitely happened, something that had frightened his parents badly enough to make them abandon their annual vacation after just 2 days. The 3-hour drive felt like an eternity. I kept expecting Dennis to pull over and explain what was really going on, but he drove straight through without stopping. When we finally pulled into Ryan's driveway, I was almost dizzy with relief. My parents were surprised to see us back so early, but they accepted Dennis's explanation about forgetting something important. I hugged them extra tight that night, grateful to be home in my own bed, surrounded by familiar sounds and smells. But the questions remained. What had Dennis really seen or heard that morning? Why had he been so desperate to get us away from the cabin? And most importantly, what had been in our room that first night? The answers to those questions didn't come until last Christmas, 3 years later. Ryan and I were both 12 now, old enough to handle the truth, according to Dennis. Our families had gathered for their annual Christmas Eve dinner, and after the younger kids had been put to bed, the adults were sitting around the living room with their coffee and wine. "Remember that cabin trip we took a few years back?" Dennis said suddenly, looking at Ryan and me. The one where we came home early? Ryan and I both nodded, immediately alert. This was the conversation we'd been waiting for. I think you boys are old enough now to hear what really happened that morning. Dennis continued, his voice serious. And I think you deserve an explanation for why we left so suddenly. Patricia looked uncomfortable, but she didn't object. Are you sure this is a good idea? They lived through it, Dennis said. They have a right to know. He took a deep breath and began his story. I got up early that morning, just after sunrise. The generator wasn't working, and I wanted to see if I could figure out what was wrong with it. I went outside and started walking around the cabin, looking for the problem. Dennis paused, running his hand through his hair. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the woods directly to the window of your room. But they weren't normal footprints. What do you mean? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. They were too big to be human, for one thing. And they were shaped wrong. Like something walking on its hands and feet, but with long, thin toes. More like claws than toes. Ryan and I exchanged glances. This matched what I'd seen inside the cabin that night. The wet prints that had mysteriously disappeared. I followed the trail around the cabin, Dennis continued. The prints went all the way around the building, stopping at every window. Whatever had made them had been checking every possible entrance, like it was looking for a way inside. Did you find where they led? I asked. Dennis nodded grimly. They went to the back of the cabin, to the old root cellar door. The door was open and the prints went down into the cellar. But here's the thing. There were no prints coming back out. The room fell silent. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I got my flashlight and went down into the cellar, Dennis said. It's just a small space, maybe 8 feet square, with stone walls and a dirt floor. But in the far corner I found something that made my blood run cold. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. There was a crude nest made from old blankets and newspapers, and scattered around it were bones. Small bones, like from rabbits or birds. But some of them looked different. What kind of different? Ryan asked in a whisper. Human different. Small human bones, like from fingers or toes. Patricia stood up abruptly. Dennis, that's enough. They don't need to hear this. Yes, they do, Dennis said firmly. They were there. They deserved to know what was living underneath them. He turned back to us. I came upstairs and told your mother to pack immediately. While she was getting everything ready, I searched the cabin one more time. I wanted to make sure that whatever was down there hadn't gotten inside during the night. Did you find anything? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. I checked your room last, Dennis said. Everything looked normal at first, but when I opened the closet door, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. He stopped talking, staring at his hands. What? Ryan prompted. Eyes, Dennis said quietly. Black eyes, watching me from the back of the closet. They were too low to be human, crouched down like an animal. And when I shined my flashlight on them, they reflected the light back at me like a cat's eyes. I felt cold all over. What did you do? I closed the door and got the hell out of there. Whatever was living in that cellar had found a way into the cabin, and it had been in your room while you were sleeping. Dennis looked at me directly. When you told us about the footprints that night, I knew you were telling the truth. But I also knew that if I confirmed what you'd seen, you'd be terrified. I thought it was better to let you think you'd imagined it. But the footprints were gone when you came to look, I said. No, they weren't, Dennis replied. They were still there. I could see them clearly. But I pretended they weren't because I didn't want to panic you before I could figure out what to do. The room was completely silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, and I couldn't help but think about that other snowy night when something inhuman had stalked around our cabin, looking for a way inside. Have you ever been back? Ryan asked. Dennis shook his head. Never, and we never will. That cabin has been in my family for generations, but some things are more important than tradition. He looked at both of us seriously. I want you boys to promise me something. If you ever find yourselves in a situation where you feel like you're being watched, where you hear strange sounds or see things that don't make sense, trust your instincts. Don't let anyone convince you that you're imagining things. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that are completely real. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Dennis's words. For 3 years, I'd wondered if I'd really seen those wet footprints, if something had really been breathing in our closet. Now I knew the truth. And somehow that was more terrifying than not knowing. Because if it had happened once, it could happen again. And next time, we might not be so lucky. The snow continued to fall as I pulled into my driveway, and I found myself checking the shadows around my house before I went inside. Some fears, once planted, never really go away. They just wait in the darkness, patient and hungry, for the right moment to return. March 15th, 2009, will forever be burned into my memory as the night that changed everything. I was 15 years old then, living with my father in a remote cabin nestled deep within 25 acres of dense woodland that straddled the border between Georgia and Tennessee. The isolation that once felt like freedom would soon become our prison. Our cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road that carved through towering pines and ancient oaks. The nearest neighbor lived 10 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain, and cell phone service was virtually non-existent. We had chosen this location specifically for its seclusion. My father craved the peace that only true wilderness could provide after years of city living had worn him down. What we hadn't anticipated was how that isolation would trap us when terror came knocking. The day had started normally enough. I spent most of the afternoon working on homework while my father repaired fence posts along our property line. Our German Shepherd, Scout, had been my constant companion since we'd rescued him as a puppy 6 months earlier. He was still young, barely 8 months old, but already showing the intelligence and loyalty that made his breed legendary. Scout followed me everywhere, his dark eyes alert and his ears always perked for any unusual sound. As evening approached, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. What had started as light cloud cover transformed into an ominous wall of storm clouds rolling in from the west. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in less than an hour, and the wind picked up significantly, causing the massive trees around our cabin to sway and creak in ways that made my skin crawl. The weatherman on our old television had predicted severe thunderstorms, but living in the mountains, we were accustomed to nature's dramatic displays. By 7 o'clock, the first fat raindrops began spattering against our windows with increasing intensity. The wind howled through the trees with a sound that seemed almost alive, almost angry. I remember thinking how the storm seemed particularly violent, even for our area known for its unpredictable weather patterns. The rain quickly escalated from gentle drops to a torrential downpour that hammered our metal roof with a deafening rhythm. Lightning began flashing with alarming frequency, illuminating our property in stark white bursts that revealed the trees bending at impossible angles. Thunder followed seconds later, each crash seeming to shake the very foundation of our small cabin. Scout became increasingly agitated, pacing between the windows and whimpering softly, behavior that was completely unlike his usually calm demeanor. My father secured the shutters and double-checked that all our emergency supplies were easily accessible. We had learned early in our wilderness living to always be prepared for extended power outages. Our backup generator sat in a small shed 50 feet from the cabin, and we kept multiple flashlights, battery-powered radios, and enough canned food to last a week stored in our pantry. The storm's intensity continued building throughout the evening. What had started as a typical spring thunderstorm evolved into something far more sinister. The wind reached speeds that made our cabin's wooden frame groan and protest with each powerful gust. Tree branches scraped against our roof with sounds that resembled fingernails on a chalkboard, setting my nerves on edge. As the night deepened, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, more violent. The lightning strikes became so frequent that our cabin was illuminated almost continuously in an eerie, strobing light that cast dancing shadows throughout our home. Each thunderclap seemed louder than the last, rattling our windows and making normal conversation nearly impossible. Scout's behavior became increasingly erratic as the storm intensified. He would stand at different windows, his hackles raised and his body rigid with tension, staring out into the darkness as if he could see something that remained invisible to us. His low growls were barely audible over the storm's chaos, but I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards when I sat near him. At exactly 9:47 p.m., the power went out. The sudden plunge into darkness was jarring after hours of the strobing lightning. Our cabin, which had felt cozy and secure just moments before, suddenly seemed vulnerable and exposed. The familiar hum of our refrigerator, the gentle glow of our table lamps, the reassuring presence of our television, all vanished in an instant, leaving us surrounded by an oppressive blackness that seemed to press against us from all sides. I was in the living room when it happened, having just finished watching an episode of The Dukes of Hazzard on our old television set. The show had been a comforting distraction from the storm's fury, its lighthearted action providing a stark contrast to the violence raging outside our walls. When the screen went black and the familiar background noises of our electronic devices died away, the full force of the storm's sound seemed to double in intensity. The rain pounding our roof became thunderous without the buffer of background noise. The wind's howling took on an almost human quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed deliberately menacing. Tree branches continued their assault on our roof and walls, but now each scrape and thud made me jump with startled fear. Scout immediately moved to my side, his warm body pressing against my leg as if sensing my growing unease. Even in the darkness, I could feel his tension, his muscles coiled and ready for action, his breathing quick and shallow. His behavior was becoming increasingly concerning, as if he sensed something in the storm that went beyond mere weather. I fumbled around in the darkness, my hands searching for the heavy-duty flashlight my father always kept on the coffee table for emergencies. The familiar weight of the metal casing felt reassuring in my grip as I clicked it on, sending a beam of bright LED light cutting through the blackness. The cone of illumination revealed our living room exactly as I had left it, but somehow everything looked different in the harsh artificial light. Shadows seemed deeper, corners appeared more ominous. The logical thing to do was find my father and discuss our situation. Our backup generator could restore power, but running it during such a violent storm posed risks. Lightning strikes on metal could be catastrophic, and the generator's noise might mask important sounds, like someone approaching our isolated cabin. I called out for my father, but my voice was swallowed by the storm's roar. He was likely in his bedroom at the far end of our cabin, possibly already preparing emergency equipment or trying to reach someone on his battery-powered radio. Our cabin wasn't large, but the storm made communication between rooms nearly impossible without shouting. As I began moving toward his room, flashlight beam sweeping ahead of me, Scout suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His entire body went rigid, and a low growl began rumbling in his throat, a sound I had never heard from him before. It was deeper, more primal than his usual warning growls when strangers approached our property. This sound spoke of genuine fear, of instinctual recognition of danger. I stopped walking and listened intently, trying to discern what had triggered Scout's reaction. At first I heard only the storm, wind, rain, thunder, and the creaking of our cabin's wooden structure. But then, underneath the natural chaos, I detected something else. Something that didn't belong. It was a sound barely perceptible above the storm's noise, but distinctly different from the natural symphony of wind and rain. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and completely out of place in our wilderness setting. As I strained to identify it, my blood began to pump faster, and my breathing became shallow with growing anxiety. The sound was footsteps. Heavy, measured footsteps circling our cabin in the darkness, just audible enough to confirm they weren't my imagination. Each step landed with significant weight, far heavier than any normal person would produce. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, as if whatever was making them was taking time to examine our home, studying it for weaknesses or points of entry. Scout's growling intensified, and he began backing away from the windows, pressing closer to me as if seeking protection. His ears were pinned back against his head, and I could see the whites of his eyes in my flashlight beam, clear signs of extreme distress in a dog that had never shown fear of anything. The footsteps continued their circuit around our cabin, pausing occasionally at what I assumed were our windows and doors. During these pauses, the silence became even more terrifying than the sound of movement. I imagined whatever was out there pressing its face against our glass, studying the interior of our home, planning its next move. The realization that something was deliberately circling our cabin sent waves of terror coursing through my body. This wasn't a lost hiker seeking shelter, nor was it one of the occasional hunters who sometimes wandered onto our property. The methodical nature of the movement, combined with Scout's obvious fear, told me that whatever was outside posed a genuine threat. I forced myself to remain as quiet as possible, controlling my breathing and moving with careful precision to avoid making any noise that might alert our unwelcome visitor to my exact location within the cabin. The flashlight in my hand suddenly felt like both a necessity and a liability. I needed its light to navigate safely, but its beam could potentially reveal my position to whatever was watching from outside. The footsteps paused directly outside our largest window, the one that faced our small front porch. I could hear what sounded like shuffling, as if something was positioning itself for a better view inside. The storm's lightning provided occasional illumination of our property, but the flashes were too brief and chaotic to reveal any clear details of what lurked in the darkness. Scout's behavior became increasingly agitated. He began moving in tight circles, his claws clicking against our hardwood floors despite his obvious attempts to remain quiet. His instincts were screaming danger, and his canine senses were detecting threats that remained invisible to me. The low growling continued rumbling in his throat, occasionally punctuated by barely audible whimpers of fear. I knew I needed to reach my father immediately. Whatever was outside our cabin required both of our attention and all of our resources to handle safely. But the journey from our living room to his bedroom at the far end of the cabin now seemed like an impossible distance to cover without being detected. The footsteps resumed their circuit, this time moving toward the side of our cabin where my father's bedroom was located. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and I began to wonder just how large whatever was making them might be. The weight behind each footfall suggested something far bigger than any normal person, perhaps 6.5 feet tall, and built with the solid mass of someone who performed heavy physical labor their entire life. As the presence moved along our cabin's exterior walls, I became aware of additional sounds that chilled me to my core. There were subtle scratching noises, as if whatever was outside was testing our walls and sighting for weak points. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like sniffing, deep, deliberate inhalations, as if our visitor was trying to gather information about the occupants inside through scent. The methodical nature of this examination was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of our situation. This wasn't random vandalism or the actions of someone under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Whatever was outside was conducting a systematic reconnaissance of our home, gathering intelligence before making its next move. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow moving past our front window, something tall and broad that didn't match the silhouette of any animal native to our area. The shape was vaguely humanoid but wrong in proportions that I couldn't quite identify in the brief illumination. Scout suddenly bolted toward my father's room, his fear apparently overcoming his instinct to stay close to me. His claws scrambled for purchase on our smooth floors as he rounded the corner leading to the bedroom hallway. I could hear his frantic scratching at my father's door, accompanied by urgent whimpering that would definitely wake my father if the storm hadn't already done so. The footsteps outside stopped abruptly. Whatever had been circling our cabin became completely motionless, and the sudden absence of sound was far more terrifying than the steady rhythm of movement had been. I realized that Scout's desperate flight to my father's room had likely been heard by our uninvited guest. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, creating a tension that made my hands shake and my heart pound so loudly I was certain it could be heard outside. Then came a new sound that nearly made me drop my flashlight in terror. Someone, or something, was testing our front door handle. The metallic clicking of the latch being manipulated was clearly audible despite the storm's ongoing fury. Our door was locked, but the sound of someone attempting to gain entry sent panic surging through my entire body. I backed away from the front of our cabin, keeping my flashlight beam pointed at the door while trying to control my breathing enough to think clearly. The handle continued turning back and forth, each movement deliberate and patient. There was no frantic urgency in these attempts, no signs of panic or desperation. Whatever was trying to get inside was taking its time, methodically testing our defenses and looking for the easiest way to gain entry. I heard my father's bedroom door open, followed by his urgent voice calling my name. Scout's warning had successfully alerted him to our situation, but now we faced the challenge of communicating our danger without alerting whatever was outside to our exact positions and numbers. "Don't move." My father's voice carried down the hallway in a harsh whisper that barely reached me over the storm's continuous roar. "Stay exactly where you are, and don't make any sudden movements." The urgency in his tone was unlike anything I had ever heard before. My father was a man who prided himself on remaining calm under pressure. He had served 2 tours in the military and worked for 15 years as a firefighter before we moved to our mountain retreat. Hearing genuine fear in his voice sent my terror to new heights and confirmed that our situation was far more serious than I had initially realized. I remained frozen in place, flashlight beam still focused on our front door, where the handle had stopped moving but remained turned to the unlocked position. The door itself hadn't opened, suggesting that our deadbolt was still engaged. But the fact that someone had successfully manipulated our main lock was deeply disturbing. "I can see you from my window," my father continued in that same urgent whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. There's something outside that isn't human. It's not like any animal I've ever seen, and it's not like any person either. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" His words hit me like physical blows. My father wasn't given to exaggeration or flights of fancy. He was a practical man who dealt in facts and evidence, someone who had seen enough real danger in his lifetime to accurately assess threats. If he was telling me that whatever was outside our cabin wasn't human, then I had no choice but to believe him completely. "What do you mean it's not human?" I whispered back, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied, and I could hear him moving around his room, probably gathering weapons and emergency supplies. I got a clear look at it when lightning lit up the backyard. It's walking on 2 legs like a person, but it's wrong. The proportions are all wrong. The way it moves is wrong, and the size is wrong. It has to be nearly 7 feet tall and built like someone who could lift a car without effort. Scout had apparently remained in my father's room, because I could hear his continued whimpering and the sound of his claws scratching against the wooden floor. Even our dog, with his limited understanding of the situation, recognized that whatever was outside posed a threat unlike anything in his previous experience. "Can you make it back here without being seen?" my father asked. I evaluated the distance between my current position and his room. The hallway was straight and relatively short, but it required passing directly beneath 2 windows that faced different sides of our property. If whatever was outside had moved since testing our front door, there was a significant chance it might see me crossing between rooms. "I think so," I whispered back. "But what if it sees me moving?" "Then you run as fast as you can and don't look back," he replied without hesitation. "I've got my shotgun loaded and ready, but we need to be together if this thing decides to force its way inside." The thought of our cabin being invaded by something my father described as not human made my stomach clench with nausea. Our home, which had always felt secure and protected, suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. The wooden walls that had kept out weather and wildlife now felt inadequate against a threat that my father, with all his military and emergency response experience, couldn't easily categorize. I began moving slowly toward his room, keeping my flashlight beam pointed at the floor to minimize the chances of it being spotted from outside. Each step felt monumental, and I found myself holding my breath as I passed beneath the first window. The storm continued raging outside, providing some cover for any small sounds I might make, but also masking any noise our unwelcome visitor might produce. As I reached the halfway point of my journey, new sounds began emanating from outside our cabin. There was a rhythmic thumping against our walls, as if something was systematically testing the structural integrity of our home. Each impact was substantial enough to slightly vibrate the floorboards beneath my feet, suggesting tremendous force behind whatever was making them. It's testing the walls. My father's voice carried a note of grim understanding. It's looking for weak spots or places where it might be able to break through. The methodical nature of this examination was perhaps more terrifying than violent assault would have been. Violence implied emotion, passion, or desperation, human motivations that could be understood and potentially reasoned with. This systematic approach suggested intelligence and planning, characteristics that made our situation exponentially more dangerous. I finally reached my father's room and slipped inside, immediately turning to help him secure the door. He had already moved his heavy dresser partway across the entrance, creating a barricade that would slow down any attempts at forced entry. His face was pale in the flashlight beam, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold temperature. Scout immediately pressed against my legs, his warm body trembling with fear, but his presence providing some small comfort in our terrifying situation. My father's shotgun lay across his bed, its dark metal gleaming in the artificial light. Boxes of shells sat open beside it, and I realized he had been preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. "What exactly did you see?" I asked, needing more details to understand what we were facing. "Something that walks upright like a man but moves like a predator," he replied grimly. "Its arms hang down past where they should, and its head doesn't sit on its shoulders the way a person's would. When the lightning illuminated it, I could see its outline clearly against the trees, and I'm telling you, it's not anything that should exist in nature." The systematic examination of our cabin's exterior continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Whatever was outside moved with patience and deliberation that suggested it had all the time in the world to find a way inside. The thumping against our walls became more focused, concentrating on areas where our structure might be weakest, around windows near the foundation, and at the corners where support beams joined. My father moved around his room with military precision, checking his ammunition supply and ensuring that his radio equipment was functioning properly. Our landline phone had gone dead when the power failed, and our cell phones showed no signal bars, leaving us completely cut off from outside help. The battery-powered emergency radio crackled with static and distant weather reports, but no voices that might provide assistance or guidance. "We need to consider the possibility that this thing might actually get inside," my father said quietly, his training overriding his fear enough to think tactically about our situation. "If that happens, we need to be ready to defend ourselves or escape quickly." He pulled out a detailed map of our property and the surrounding wilderness, spreading it across his bed in the flashlight beam. Using his finger, he traced potential escape routes that would lead us away from our cabin and toward the nearest road where we might encounter other people or find help. "The problem is that we don't know if this is just one individual or if there might be others," he continued, his voice grim with realization. "If we run outside and there are more of them waiting, we could be trapped in the open with nowhere to hide." Scout suddenly lifted his head from where he had been lying beside the bed, his ears perked forward and his body rigid with attention. A low growl began rumbling in his throat, but this time it carried a different quality. Less fear and more warning, as if he had detected a change in our situation that required immediate attention. The sounds from outside our cabin had stopped completely. The abrupt silence was far more ominous than the systematic testing had been. At least when we could hear movement, we knew where our unwelcome visitor was located and what it was doing. Now, in the absence of any audible activity, our imaginations began filling the void with possibilities that were somehow worse than the reality we had been experiencing. "It's repositioning," my father whispered, moving toward his window but staying well back from the glass. "Whatever it was doing out there, it's finished, and now it's moving to the next phase of whatever it has planned." The storm continued its assault on our cabin, but even the thunder and lightning seemed subdued compared to the tension that now filled our small space. Every sound became suspect. Every shadow in our flashlight beams could potentially hide something threatening. The familiar surroundings of my father's bedroom now felt like a bunker under siege. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of our front door opening. Despite our deadbolt, despite our locked handle, despite every precaution we had taken, something had gained entry to our cabin. The hinges creaked slightly as the door swung open, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crossing our threshold and entering our living room. "How is that possible?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. My father's face had gone completely pale, and his hands tightened around his shotgun with white-knuckled intensity. He moved closer to our bedroom door, listening intently to the sounds coming from the front of our cabin. Scout pressed himself against the floor, his body language indicating that he wanted to hide but was prepared to fight if necessary. The footsteps moved slowly through our living room, pausing occasionally as if whatever had entered was examining our belongings or familiarizing itself with the layout of our home. Each footfall was heavy and deliberate, confirming my father's assessment about the size and weight of our intruder. "We need to get out of here right now," my father whispered urgently. "Whatever that thing is, it's inside our house, and we don't want to be trapped in here with it." He moved to his window and carefully examined the screen and latch mechanism. Our cabin sat elevated on a foundation that put the bedroom windows about 4 feet off the ground. Not an impossible drop, but one that would require careful maneuvering, especially in the darkness and storm conditions. The footsteps in our living room began moving toward the back of the cabin, heading in the direction of our hallway and bedrooms. Whatever had entered our home was conducting the same methodical examination of the interior that it had performed outside, systematically exploring each room and gathering information about the layout. "It's coming this way," my father said grimly. "We have maybe 30 seconds before it reaches this door." He quickly began removing the screen from his window while I gathered our emergency supplies and prepared Scout for an escape attempt. The storm's wind immediately began whipping rain into the room through the open window, but the discomfort was insignificant compared to our need to escape whatever was moving through our cabin. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder and more distinct. I could hear them pausing at each room, accompanied by sounds that suggested doors were being opened and interiors examined. Whatever was searching our home was being thorough, leaving no space unexplored as it moved closer to our location. "You go first," my father ordered, helping me climb through the window opening. "Take Scout and head for the tree line. Don't stop running until you reach the main road." Just as I swung my leg over the windowsill, preparing to drop to the ground outside, the sound of splintering wood erupted from the front of our cabin. The crash was enormous, easily audible over the storm's fury, and was followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of our front door being ripped from its hinges with tremendous force. "Change of plans," my father said grimly, pulling me back inside and moving quickly to barricade our bedroom door with additional furniture. Whatever that was, it just demonstrated that locked doors aren't going to slow it down much. The heavy footsteps that had been methodically exploring our cabin now moved with increased speed and purpose. Whatever had been inside was no longer being cautious about detection. It knew we were here, and it was coming directly for our location. The sound of its movement suggested something far larger and more powerful than any normal intruder. Scout began barking frantically, his courage finally overcoming his fear as his protective instincts kicked in. The sharp, aggressive barks echoed through our small cabin, providing the first real sound of defiance since our ordeal began. My father didn't try to quiet him. At this point, stealth was no longer an option, and Scout's warning might serve as a deterrent. The thing in our hallway paused outside our bedroom door. I could hear it breathing, deep, labored inhalations that sounded wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The rhythm was too slow, the volume too great, and there was a wet, congested quality that suggested something fundamentally different from normal human respiratory patterns. Then came the first impact against our door. The entire frame shook with the force of the blow, and I could see the wood beginning to crack around the hinges. Our barricade of furniture shifted slightly, but held firm, buying us precious seconds to prepare for what seemed inevitable. My father raised his shotgun, positioning himself to have a clear line of fire when the door finally gave way. "Stay behind me and be ready to run," he instructed, his voice steady despite the terror of our situation. "If this goes badly, you take Scout and you get out of here no matter what happens to me." The second impact was even stronger than the first. The door frame splintered visibly, and our furniture barricade slid backward several inches across the floor. Whatever was trying to break in possessed strength that defied rational explanation, the kind of force that should have required heavy machinery or multiple people working together. Scout positioned himself between us and the door, his hackles raised and his teeth bared in a display of aggression that would have been impressive against any normal threat. But as the third impact shook our entire room, I realized that his courage, while admirable, would be little protection against whatever possessed the power to demolish our defenses so easily. The fourth impact finally breached our door. Wood exploded inward in a shower of splinters and debris, and our furniture barricade was scattered across the room as if it weighed nothing. Through the destroyed entrance, I caught my first glimpse of what had been terrorizing us, and the sight would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, just as my father had described, but the reality was far more terrifying than any description could convey. Its proportions were wrong in every conceivable way: arms that hung too low, shoulders that were too broad, and a head that sat at an unnatural angle on its massive frame. In the chaotic illumination of our flashlight beams and the storm's lightning, I could see that its clothing was torn and filthy, as if it had been living in the wilderness for an extended period. But it was the face that would forever be burned into my memory. What I could see of its features in the erratic lighting appeared human, but distorted, as if someone had taken a normal person and stretched and twisted their characteristics into something that triggered every instinctual fear response built into human psychology. The eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of a nocturnal animal, and when it opened its mouth, I could see teeth that were far too large and too sharp for any person. My father didn't hesitate. The shotgun boomed in the confined space of our bedroom, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding us all, and the concussion making my ears ring. But instead of falling or retreating, the thing simply staggered backward half a step, and then began moving forward again, apparently more annoyed than injured by the blast. "Run!" my father shouted, working the action on his shotgun to chamber another round. "Get out of here right now!" But there was nowhere to run. The thing filled our doorway completely, blocking our only exit from the room. The window remained open behind us, but reaching it would require getting past our intruder or somehow convincing it to move aside, neither of which seemed likely given its apparent hostile intentions. The creature took another step into our room, and I could smell something that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. It was a combination of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something else that I couldn't identify, but that triggered every warning signal in my primitive brain. This was the smell of something that didn't belong in the civilized world, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Scout launched himself at the intruder with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including the creature itself. His attack was brave but ultimately futile. The thing simply swatted him aside with one massive arm, sending our dog crashing into the wall with a yelp of pain and surprise. Scout hit the floor hard but immediately scrambled back to his feet, apparently more stunned than seriously injured. My father fired again, this time aiming higher and achieving what appeared to be a more effective hit. The creature stumbled backward through our destroyed doorway, giving us our first opportunity to escape since the siege began. "The window, now!" he commanded, and this time I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the window opening without considering the drop, landing hard on the rain-soaked ground outside my father's bedroom. The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent sharp pains shooting through my knees and ankles, but adrenaline masked most of the discomfort. Scout landed beside me a second later, apparently having made the same leap with more canine grace. My father followed immediately after, clutching his shotgun and a small emergency bag. He hit the ground running, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the tree line without pausing to assess our surroundings or check for injuries. Behind us, I could hear the creature moving through our cabin, its heavy footsteps accompanied by the sounds of furniture being overturned and walls being damaged. "Don't look back," my father commanded as we ran through the storm toward the relative safety of the woods. "Whatever you do, don't look back, and don't slow down until we reach the main road." The rain was falling in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible beyond a few feet. Lightning continued providing sporadic illumination of our flight path, but the brief flashes also created confusing shadows that made navigation treacherous. The ground beneath our feet was muddy and slippery, covered with fallen branches and debris from the storm's ongoing assault. Scout ran beside us, occasionally stumbling but maintaining our pace despite his earlier collision with the wall. His presence provided some comfort, but I could tell he was favoring his left side where he had impacted our bedroom wall. The fact that he continued running without complaint spoke to both his determination and the severity of our situation. Behind us, the sounds from our cabin grew louder and more destructive. I could hear glass breaking, wood splintering, and what sounded like entire sections of wall being torn apart. Whatever we had left behind was systematically destroying our home, either searching for something specific or simply venting its rage at our escape. "What was that thing?" I gasped as we pushed through the underbrush toward the dirt road that connected our property to the outside world. "I don't know," my father replied honestly, his breathing labored from our desperate flight. "But I know it wasn't anything natural, and I know we're lucky to be alive right now." The main road was still nearly a mile away through difficult terrain, and I was already beginning to feel the effects of our desperate sprint. My lungs burned from the cold air and physical exertion, and my legs felt increasingly unsteady as we navigated fallen logs and patches of thorny undergrowth. The storm continued hammering us with rain and wind, making our escape even more challenging. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Far behind us, barely visible through the trees and rain, a tall figure was moving in our direction. It wasn't running, but its long stride was covering ground with alarming efficiency. Whatever we had left in our cabin had decided to pursue us into the wilderness. "It's following us," I managed to say between gasping breaths. My father glanced back just as another lightning flash confirmed my observation. His face went pale, and he immediately changed our direction, angling toward a section of forest where the trees grew more densely and might provide better concealment. "We need to find somewhere to hide until daylight," he said grimly. "Running in the open isn't going to work if that thing can track us through the forest." Scout seemed to understand our need for concealment because he immediately began leading us toward a particularly thick stand of pine trees whose low-hanging branches created natural shelter from both the storm and observation. We crawled underneath the dense canopy, pressing ourselves against the trunk of the largest tree and trying to control our breathing enough to listen for pursuit. The rain drumming against the pine needles above our heads provided some acoustic cover, but it also masked any sounds that might indicate whether our pursuer was still following our trail. We huddled together in the darkness, sharing body heat and drawing what comfort we could from each other's presence while we waited to see if our hiding place would be discovered. Minutes passed like hours as we strained to hear any indication of movement in the forest around us. The storm continued its assault, and occasionally lightning would illuminate our immediate surroundings. But we saw no sign of the creature that had destroyed our home and driven us into the wilderness. "We need to keep moving toward the road," my father finally whispered. "Staying here too long is just giving it more time to track us down." As we prepared to continue our escape, Scout suddenly lifted his head and looked back in the direction we had come. His ears were perked forward, and a low growl began rumbling in his throat, the same warning sound he had made when the creature first approached our cabin. Whatever was hunting us through the forest had found our trail again. We spent the remainder of that terrifying night moving through the forest in short sprints, hiding whenever Scout's behavior indicated that our pursuer was getting close, and gradually working our way toward the main road where we might find help or at least escape our isolated predicament. The creature seemed to be tracking us with supernatural ability, always appearing to know our general direction despite our attempts at concealment and misdirection. Dawn finally began breaking around 6:30 in the morning, and with the first gray light filtering through the storm clouds, we heard the most welcome sound imaginable: the distant rumble of a vehicle on the main road. My father immediately began leading us toward the sound, abandoning all attempts at stealth in favor of speed as we crashed through the underbrush toward potential salvation. The truck belonged to our nearest neighbor, a man named Vernon who lived 10 miles away and was apparently heading to town for supplies despite the storm conditions. When he saw 3 muddy, terrified people emerge from the forest and flag him down, he immediately pulled over and began asking questions that we were barely coherent enough to answer. "Something attacked our cabin," my father managed to explain between gasping breaths. We need to get to town and call the police immediately. Vernon didn't ask for details. The obvious terror in our faces and our bedraggled condition were explanation enough. He helped us into his truck, made room for Scout in the back seat, and began driving toward town while my father used his cell phone to contact emergency services. The conversation with the 911 dispatcher was surreal. How do you explain to someone that your home was invaded by something that didn't appear entirely human? How do you describe footprints that looked more like claws than feet? How do you convince trained professionals to take seriously a report that sounded like something from a horror movie? The police arrived at our property 3 hours later, accompanied by paramedics and a representative from the sheriff's department. What they found confirmed our story in ways that were both validating and deeply disturbing. Our cabin had been completely destroyed, not just damaged, but systematically torn apart, as if something with tremendous strength had gone room by room, pulling down walls and destroying everything inside. The tracks around our property were unlike anything the investigating officers had seen before. They were definitely made by something bipedal, but the size and shape were wrong for any known animal or person. The stride length suggested something nearly 7 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions in the muddy ground indicated weight that would have been impossible for a normal human. Inside our destroyed cabin, investigators found evidence of tremendous force being applied to structural elements that should have required heavy equipment to damage. Support beams had been snapped in half, walls had been punched through, and our furniture had been scattered as if it weighed nothing. The official report listed the incident as vandalism by unknown perpetrators, but I could see in the officers' faces that they knew this explanation didn't adequately account for the evidence they had documented. The amount of destruction would have required multiple people working with tools, but there were no tool marks on any of the damaged surfaces. Everything appeared to have been torn apart by hand. We never returned to live in those woods. My father arranged for a salvage crew to remove anything of value from the wreckage, but he refused to accompany them, and he insisted that they work only during daylight hours with multiple people present at all times. Even then, the crew reported feeling uneasy during their work, as if they were being watched from the surrounding forest. Scout recovered from his injuries within a few days, but his behavior was permanently changed by our experience. He became extremely protective of our family and showed signs of anxiety whenever we were in wooded areas or rural locations. Veterinarians found no physical explanation for his behavioral changes, but I understood completely. He had seen something that challenged his understanding of the natural world, just as we had. The insurance company eventually paid our claim, though the adjuster clearly had doubts about the official explanation for the damage. The amount of destruction was simply too extensive to have been caused by normal vandalism, and the specific patterns of damage suggested something that defied conventional explanation. We moved to a suburban neighborhood where our nearest neighbors were less than 100 feet away, and where the sound of human activity provided constant reassurance that we were not alone or isolated. My father sold his hunting equipment and showed no interest in outdoor activities that might take us away from populated areas. 10 years have passed since that night, and I still wake up sometimes from dreams where I can hear heavy footsteps circling my home in the darkness. I've never spoken publicly about what we experienced, and I doubt anyone would believe the complete truth even if I did. But I know what I saw, and I know what hunted us through those woods on that storm-torn night in March 2009. Whatever exists in the wilderness between Georgia and Tennessee, it's still out there. The forest holds secrets that civilization has forgotten, and sometimes those secrets decide to remind us that humanity's dominion over the natural world is neither complete nor permanent. We learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible, and it's a knowledge that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. I often wonder if other families living in isolated areas have encountered similar experiences, and whether the official explanations for unexplained incidents adequately account for the reality of what might be sharing our world. But mostly, I'm grateful that we survived our encounter, and I pray that whatever we left behind in those woods remains content to stay hidden in the darkness where it belongs. The decision to hike the Anasazi Trail came after months of desk work had left me desperate for wilderness. April 2023, I just turned 32 and promised myself more adventure, less routine. The remote trail system in northern Arizona was perfect: challenging terrain, minimal traffic, and a chance to test the expensive gear gathering dust in my closet. Online forums described the area as pristine and untouched, but occasionally mentioned odd wildlife encounters. One user claimed hearing unexplained vocalizations at night. Another insisted their food cache had been meticulously dismantled while they slept. Most dismiss these as encounters with clever bears or mountain lions. Perfect material for campfire stories. Nothing more. My research led me to an obscure hiking journal where someone mentioned local Native American warnings about traveling alone in those woods. Something about the land being sacred, inhabited by entities that shouldn't be disturbed. I dismissed it as cultural superstition overlaid on natural phenomena. I'd always been skeptical of supernatural claims. I packed meticulously: topographical maps, emergency satellite beacon, first aid supplies, water purifier, and enough food for 7 days, though I planned for 5. The preparations felt excessive, but isolation demands caution. Once you're 20 miles from civilization with no cell service, self-reliance becomes your only safety net. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived Tuesday morning. The registration logbook showed only 2 other hikers had entered in the past week. Both had marked their exit dates already. I hesitated before signing my name and planned route. Something felt wrong about announcing my presence and intentions to the empty forest. The first day passed uneventfully. The trail wound through dense pine forest before climbing into rocky terrain. I covered 12 miles before setting up camp near a small stream. As daylight faded, the silence became oppressive. No insect chirps, no night birds, just the occasional whisper of wind through needles. Even the stream seemed to move without sound, water sliding silently over ancient stones. That first night, exhaustion overwhelmed any unease. I fell asleep quickly inside my tent, the forest around me fading to black. A sound woke me around 3 a.m., something large moving through brush nearby. Not unusual in wilderness areas, but the deliberate pace suggested it wasn't simply passing through. It circled my campsite 3 times before stopping directly outside my tent. I froze, barely breathing, my hand finding the hunting knife beside my sleeping bag. Minutes passed. Whatever stood outside remained motionless. No breathing sounds, no shuffling feet. Just presence. I considered my options: make noise to scare it away, use the emergency beacon. Both seemed premature. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, attributing the encounter to deer or elk curious about human intrusion. Morning revealed no tracks around my tent, despite soft ground that should have recorded any visitor. My food bag, properly suspended from a tree branch, remained untouched. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet something felt fundamentally wrong with the forest. Birds that should have announced dawn remained silent. Small animals were conspicuously absent. I packed quickly, eager to continue deeper into the wilderness. As I shouldered my backpack, movement caught my eye. Something watching from between distant trees. Just a glimpse. Tall, impossibly thin, upright. When I turned fully toward it, nothing remained but swaying branches. That should have been my first warning. The second day brought me deeper into increasingly remote territory. The maintained trail gradually disappeared, replaced by occasional rock cairns marking the route. My topo map showed I was following an ancient path once used by indigenous people traveling between seasonal settlements. Around midday, I encountered another hiker, the first person I'd seen since beginning the trek. He was heading back toward the trailhead, moving with uncomfortable haste despite the difficult terrain. We stopped briefly to exchange information. "Going much further?" he asked, eyes darting between me and the path behind me. "Planning to reach Broken Mesa by tomorrow," I replied. His expression changed subtly. "I wouldn't," he said. "Weather's turning bad up there." The sky was clear blue, temperatures mild for April. No forecast had mentioned storms. "You from around here?" I asked. "No, but I talked to some locals before hiking in. They don't recommend camping beyond the ridgeline." He hesitated. "Said there have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" Missing hikers. Strange animal behavior. He shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm not superstitious, but something's off in these woods. Started feeling watched yesterday. Found footprints around my tent this morning. Human, but wrong somehow. Too deep in some places, barely visible in others. Same stride length as a person, but too wide apart. I nodded politely while mentally cataloging him as overly imaginative. Wilderness often triggers primal fears in the unprepared. Anything specific I should watch for? I asked. Don't hike after sunset. Don't investigate strange sounds. And if you feel like something's watching you... He adjusted his pack. You're probably right. We parted ways, his warning lingering uncomfortably as I continued upward. The forest changed character as I climbed. Trees became stunted and twisted, fighting for sunlight on steeper slopes. Wind patterns created unusual acoustics, sometimes carrying sounds from miles away while muffling those nearby. That afternoon, I found something disturbing, a deer carcass arranged unnaturally. The animal hadn't been consumed by predators, but systematically dismembered, limbs positioned in a deliberate pattern. No blood surrounded it, despite the extensive manipulation. Whatever killed it had done so elsewhere before placing it here. Wildlife management would attribute this to mountain lion behavior. They sometimes cache kills. But something about the arrangement felt intentional, communicative even. I photographed it before continuing, suddenly conscious of eyes tracking my movement through the trees. As daylight waned, I selected a campsite atop a rock outcropping offering clear sightlines in all directions. Defensive positioning isn't typically my priority when camping, but unease had slowly accumulated throughout the day. I gathered extra firewood, built my camp meticulously, and rigged thin cordage with embedded aluminum cans around the perimeter, an improvised alarm system. The preparations occupied my mind, keeping darker thoughts at bay. After dinner, I sorted through the day's photographs. The deer carcass images contained something I hadn't noticed in person: partial boot prints around the arrangement. Human presence, not animal. Perhaps game wardens investigating poaching? But why leave it displayed rather than removing it? Night fell completely. My fire burned low. The silence intensified until my heartbeat seemed offensively loud. I was preparing for sleep when I heard it. Rhythmic footsteps circling my position. Too regular for an animal, too persistent for another hiker. The footsteps maintained perfect timing, always just beyond firelight. When I shined my flashlight toward the sound, the steps immediately stopped, resuming only when darkness returned. This continued for hours. My alarm system never triggered, suggesting whatever circled remained just beyond my perimeter. Around midnight, I shouted into the darkness, demanding identification. My voice echoed unanswered across the canyon. The footsteps ceased temporarily before resuming at precisely the same pace, neither intimidated nor provoked by my challenge. I didn't sleep. As dawn approached, I heard a single set of retreating footsteps, followed by a high-pitched sound somewhere between whistle and scream, carrying impossibly far across the morning air. The discovery of boot prints around my campsite that morning confirmed someone had indeed circled my position throughout the night. The impressions matched those I'd photographed near the deer carcass, standard hiking treads but with unusual depth distribution, as if whoever made them carried tremendous weight despite moving silently. I considered turning back. The satellite phone offered connection to emergency services, but what would I report? Footprints? Strange sounds? Nothing constituted legitimate danger, only unease. Pride prevented retreat. I'd planned this trip for months, and rational thought suggested a human explanation existed for everything I'd experienced. My route that day would take me through a narrow valley toward Broken Mesa, where ancient cliff dwellings supposedly remained partially intact. The trail descended sharply into denser forest before following a seasonal stream bed. Visibility decreased dramatically compared to previous terrain. 3 miles into the day's hike, I found a small leather pouch hanging from a tree branch directly across the path, positioned at eye level, impossible to miss. The placement was too deliberate to be accidental loss. Inside, small bones, feathers, and a piece of paper with crude charcoal drawings showing stick figures fleeing from a tall, elongated shape. Something crunched underfoot as I examined the contents. Looking down, I discovered a perfect circle of teeth, animal teeth, arranged on the ground. Different sizes, different species, positioned with mathematical precision. These weren't random forest findings. Someone was creating these displays, intentionally placing them where hikers would encounter them. Warning signs, threats, territorial markers. The methodical arrangement suggested purpose beyond simple vandalism. I photographed everything before continuing, increasingly certain I was being hazed by locals. Perhaps they resented outsiders exploring sacred lands. The thought should have comforted me. Human antagonists are predictable compared to the alternative, but something about the escalating strangeness felt beyond typical territorial behavior. Midday brought me to a small clearing where I stopped for lunch. While eating, I noticed unusual scratches on nearby trees. Not typical bear markings, but deliberate patterns carved into bark at consistent heights. Some resembled crude representations of people with elongated limbs. Others depicted unrecognizable symbols. The carvings were weathered, suggesting age, yet precise enough to indicate deliberate creation. As I followed their distribution, I realized they formed a rough circle around the clearing, almost like boundary markers. My water supply was running lower than planned. The seasonal stream marked on my map had dried prematurely, forcing reliance on carried reserves. I needed to locate another water source before nightfall or consider adjusting my route. The trail began to show signs of disuse, overgrown sections, collapsed portions, missing markers. Navigation became increasingly challenging as afternoon progressed. According to GPS, I remained on track, but discrepancies between map features and actual terrain suggested I'd strayed onto an unnamed path. Around 4 p.m., I encountered an elderly indigenous man sitting beside the trail. His presence was startling after days of isolation. He wore modern hiking clothes but carried a traditional walking stick adorned with feathers and small carvings. "You're off course," he said without introduction. "I'm heading to Broken Mesa," I replied. "That's not this path." He gestured vaguely eastward. "Mesa's that way, about 5 miles, but you shouldn't go there tonight." I explained my water situation. He pointed to a location on my map. "Spring there, good water. Camp nearby tonight, but build your fire big and don't leave it until morning." Something in his tone shifted my skepticism. I asked about the strange arrangements I'd found. The deer, the teeth, the hanging pouch. His expression darkened. "Those weren't meant for you specifically. They're boundaries. Warnings." "Warning against what?" He studied me carefully before answering. "There are guardians in these forests. They protect sacred places from intrusion. Mostly they observe, but sometimes—" He trailed off, looking toward the darkening tree line. "You're talking about skinwalkers," I said, recalling legends from my research. His gaze sharpened. "We don't use that word carelessly. Names have power." He stood abruptly. "Follow the game trail east to water. Make noise as you travel, sing, talk to yourself. But stop immediately if you hear a response. Stay near your fire tonight." Before I could ask more questions, he walked away, disappearing into the forest with surprising speed for his apparent age. The encounter left me unsettled. His warnings aligned too closely with what I'd experienced to dismiss entirely. Yet accepting his explanation meant acknowledging possibilities beyond my rational worldview. I located the spring before sunset and established camp on elevated ground nearby. Following the old man's advice, I built the largest fire safely possible and arranged my sleeping bag beside it rather than setting up my tent. As darkness fell completely, the forest around me transformed. Shadows moved independent of wind. Branches cracked at irregular intervals, always just beyond firelight. The spring water bubbled quietly, occasionally producing sounds almost like whispered words. I maintained the fire meticulously, feeding it at regular intervals throughout the night. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts between hyper-vigilant periods of alertness. The night hours stretched interminably. Just before dawn, during the darkest part of night, something approached from the tree line. a tall, unnaturally thin silhouette barely visible against the black forest backdrop. It stood motionless at the edge of my camp, partially hidden behind a pine trunk, watching. I fed the fire frantically, sending sparks skyward. When flames illuminated the area more brightly, nothing remained but empty woods and morning mist. The psychological weight of 3 nights with minimal sleep affected my judgment. Morning brought momentary clarity. I needed to abort this increasingly unsettling trip. Pride wasn't worth risking safety, real or perceived. I packed efficiently, planning to hike directly toward the nearest forest access road marked on my map. The most direct route required passing near Broken Mesa, the destination I'd originally planned as my turnaround point. Despite my decision to exit the wilderness, curiosity pulled me toward a brief detour to view the ancient dwellings from a distance. The mesa loomed impressively against clear sky, its sheer rock face marked by natural caves and constructed ruins. Binoculars revealed stonework partially collapsed but recognizably intentional. Homes built by people long vanished from this landscape. Something moved between the distant structures, just a flicker of motion catching peripheral vision. I adjusted focus, but saw only empty doorways and shadow-filled interiors. The old dwellings remained still, abandoned for centuries. My chosen exit route followed a canyon descending eastward toward more traveled areas. The path narrowed dangerously in places, forcing careful navigation across loose scree and along precipitous ledges. Progress slowed beyond expectations. Midday brought unexpected discovery. Fresh bear tracks pressed into damp earth near a small seep. The prints were enormous, suggesting a male in his prime. Their presence explained much of what I'd experienced. Territorial marking, nighttime investigation of my camp, perhaps even the dismembered deer. Bears occasionally arrange food remains in ways that appear deliberate to human observers. The rational explanation calmed me temporarily. Even the largest bear represents a known threat with established countermeasures. I secured my food more carefully and continued hiking with renewed confidence. That confidence evaporated when I found human footprints overlapping the bear tracks, the same distinctive boot pattern I'd seen previously, but now clearly following the bear. Not avoiding it, tracking it. The implications disturbed me profoundly. What person deliberately pursues an apex predator through remote wilderness? By late afternoon, the canyon walls crowded closer, creating deeper shadows despite daylight. The temperature dropped noticeably. Wind funneled through the narrow passage, creating eerie harmonics that sometimes resembled distant voices. I misjudged remaining daylight. The high canyon walls accelerated darkness, leaving me scrambling to establish camp in near twilight conditions. The only suitable location, a small sandy area beside the creek, featured disturbing characteristics I noticed too late. Scattered across the ground, small animal bones arranged in concentric circles, crude symbols scratched into tree trunks surrounding the site, stones stacked in unnatural configurations. Most concerning, the unmistakable outline of a human figure pressed into sand nearby, as if someone had lain there recently before carefully standing to preserve the impression. No viable alternatives existed within reasonable hiking distance. I established camp reluctantly, building another large fire and positioning my tent with its opening facing the flames. Night descended completely. My headlamp illuminated only immediate surroundings, the beam swallowed by absolute darkness beyond. The canyon walls created unusual acoustics, sometimes amplifying distant sounds while dampening nearby ones. Activity began around midnight, subtle at first. Small rocks dislodged from canyon walls, clattering downward. Twigs snapped near the perimeter of my camp. Something splashed in the creek repeatedly, moving upstream toward my position. I remained inside my tent, clutching my hunting knife while maintaining verbal commentary, talking continuously to myself, demonstrating human presence. The old man's advice echoed, "Make noise, but stop if you receive response." The response came around 2 a.m., a perfect mimicry of my own voice repeating my last sentence from the darkness beyond my fire. The imitation was flawless in pitch and cadence but emotionless, mechanical in delivery. I fell silent immediately. The mimicry continued, cycling through phrases I'd spoken earlier, delivered in my exact voice but with subtly wrong emphasis. The effect was profoundly disturbing, hearing myself speak words I wasn't saying. The imitation gradually changed, becoming less accurate, developing strange harmonics beneath the words. The voice moved continuously, circling my camp precisely as the footsteps had previous nights. I maintained position inside my tent, controlling breathing, minimizing movement. The satellite phone remained in my pack. Reaching it required exposing myself. The hunting knife provided minimal reassurance against whatever circled outside. Around 3 a.m., the mimicry stopped abruptly. Silence returned so completely I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came sounds no human throat should produce. Clicking vocalizations interspersed with low, rattling growls combining characteristics of multiple predator species simultaneously. Something heavy pressed against my tent wall. Not enough to collapse it, but sufficient to demonstrate presence inches from where I lay. The fabric distended inward, forming an impression approximately hand-shaped but too large, fingers too elongated. I remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing. The pressure maintained for several minutes before withdrawing. Footsteps circled once more before receding upstream, deliberate, unhurried. Dawn arrived after interminable night hours. I emerged cautiously, discovering my campsite systematically altered. Every item left outside my tent had been moved precisely 3 feet from its original position. My backpack contents had been removed, examined, and meticulously repacked, but with each item inverted or reversed. Most disturbing, a crude human effigy assembled from sticks and pine needles leaned against a nearby tree, roughly my height, wearing a small strip torn from my bandana. The message seemed unmistakable. I was being studied, my possessions inventoried, my characteristics recorded by something possessing human-like intelligence but non-human motivation. I packed frantically, abandoned breakfast, and resumed hiking toward civilization with renewed urgency. The canyon gradually widened as morning progressed, offering increased visibility and psychological comfort. My satellite GPS indicated approximately 15 miles remained before reaching forest access roads. Achievable in one long day if nothing impeded progress. The canyon trail gradually improved as it approached more frequently traveled areas. Boot prints from other hikers appeared occasionally, alleviating isolation. By noon, I'd covered nearly 8 miles despite difficult terrain and physical exhaustion. The forest changed character subtly, less primeval, more managed. Evidence of logging operations decades past appeared intermittently. Human influence provided psychological comfort despite unchanged isolation. Around 2 p.m., I encountered another hiker, a middle-aged man with extensive backcountry experience apparent in his gear selection and movement. We exchanged brief greetings before he asked the question clearly prompted by my appearance. "You all right? You look like you've been through something rough." I hesitated, weighing how much to share. Had some unsettling experiences back near Broken Mesa. Possible bear encounters, maybe someone messing with my campsite. His expression registered immediate recognition. Let me guess. Things moved around? Strange arrangements left for you to find, feeling watched constantly. The accuracy of his assessment startled me. You've experienced it too? 3 years ago, solo trek through the same area. He gestured toward a faded scar running along his forearm. Got this climbing down a ravine too fast trying to get out. Whatever's back there, it doesn't like solitary hikers in its territory. You believe it's a person? I asked. Started thinking that. Makes sense. Territorial local, maybe someone unbalanced living off-grid. But then I found tracks after rainfall. He paused. Human-shaped but wrong proportions. Too long, strange weight distribution. And they appeared behind me in places I'd just checked minutes before. We compared experiences while continuing toward the trailhead. His encounter had ended when he reached more trafficked areas, the phenomenon apparently avoiding witness concentration. Local indigenous population has legends, he explained. Something that guards boundaries between their sacred lands and outside world. Most consider it symbolic, but older tribal members take it literally. The Skinwalker legends, I suggested. He nodded uncomfortably. That's the popularized version. Their actual beliefs are more complex. Entities that exist in transitional spaces, neither fully physical nor spiritual. They believe acknowledging or naming these things directly invites attention. Too late for that, I replied grimly. We hiked together until our paths diverged 3 miles later, his route leading to a different trailhead than my planned exit. Before departing, he offered final advice. Whatever you experienced, it typically stops once you're back in populated areas. But for weeks afterward, watch for signs it followed. Objects moved in your home. Unexplained sounds at night. If that happens, find someone from the local tribe. They have protocols for breaking connections once established. The warning lingered as I continued alone. 8 miles remained before reaching my vehicle, challenging but achievable before nightfall if I maintained pace. 5 miles from the trailhead, I discovered something profoundly unsettling. My own boot prints heading in the opposite direction, unmistakably mine based on distinctive wear patterns, apparently made recently in soft earth. Impossible given I hadn't passed this way previously. The implications paralyzed me momentarily. Either someone wearing identical boots had preceded me, or something capable of perfect mimicry was creating deliberate psychological distress. The discovery accelerated my pace to near running despite exhaustion and heavy pack. Rational thought eroded under primal fear response. I needed to reach civilization before nightfall regardless of physical cost. 3 miles from safety, the forest darkened prematurely. Weather conditions had changed while I focused on hiking. Heavy cloud cover now blocked afternoon sun, creating artificial twilight hours before actual sunset. The temperature dropped dramatically. Wind patterns shifted, now blowing directly against my back, carrying my scent forward along the trail ahead. Periodic gusts brought unusual sounds, clicking vocalizations, branch movements inconsistent with natural wind effects, occasional mimicry of hiking rhythms pacing mine precisely. 2 miles from the trailhead, I discovered fresh tracks alongside the trail, the same distinctive human but wrong footprints I'd observed previously. They paralleled my route without overlapping it, maintaining consistent distance like an escort rather than pursuit. The tracks occasionally disappeared completely, despite continuous soft ground that should have recorded passage. In several locations, they transitioned from leading ahead of me to suddenly appearing behind, as if whatever made them could relocate instantaneously. 1 mile from safety, with fading light reducing visibility dramatically, I heard it clearly. Something moving parallel through forest undergrowth, matching my pace precisely. When I accelerated, it accelerated. When terrain forced me to slow, it slowed accordingly. I abandoned the trail completely, choosing direct route regardless of obstacles. Safety lay in roads, vehicles, other humans, civilization's infrastructure rather than established paths. The forest responded immediately. Deadfall appeared in previously clear areas, forcing detours. Thorny undergrowth materialized where satellite imagery had shown open terrain. Navigation became increasingly challenging as landmarks shifted between reference points. Half-mile from trailhead parking, with vehicle theoretically visible through thinning trees, I encountered final barrier, a ravine not marked on any map, too steep to descend safely in failing light. The trail bridge appeared distantly to my right, requiring backtracking through darkening forest. The decision formed instinctively, forward momentum maintained regardless of hazard. I half climbed, half slid down the ravine slope, abandoning caution for speed. Equipment snagged on protruding roots, tearing fabric and flesh equally. The descent ended in controlled fall, impact partially absorbed by backpack. Rising painfully from impact, I heard it behind me. Heavy breathing combining human and animal characteristics simultaneously. Something large displaced vegetation on the slope I'd just descended, moving with deliberate restraint rather than pursuit urgency. I ran without looking back, abandoning dropped equipment without hesitation. The parking area materialized through final tree line, my vehicle exactly where I'd left it days earlier. Fumbling keys with trembling hands, I achieved access and ignition simultaneously. Headlights illuminated empty forest edge as I accelerated away. The rearview mirror reflected nothing beyond normal darkness. The encounter appeared concluded with my escape. That perception lasted exactly 3 miles down Forest Access Road, until headlights revealed something impossible standing directly in the roadway ahead. Humanoid but proportionally wrong, impossibly tall and thin, composed more of shadow than substance. I swerved instinctively, vehicle momentarily leaving pavement before correcting. When headlights realigned with road, nothing remained visible. The experience might have been dismissed as hallucination produced by fear and exhaustion, except for one detail. When I reached home hours later, my backpack contained something never packed, a small leather pouch identical to what I'd found hanging in the forest days earlier. Inside, a crude charcoal drawing showing my vehicle on Forest Road, observed by elongated figures among trees. 2 weeks passed before I could articulate what happened coherently enough to document. The experience resisted traditional narrative structure, events connected symbolically rather than causally, details simultaneously vivid and ambiguous depending on context. Initial research into local indigenous beliefs revealed complex cosmology involving guardian entities protecting boundaries between worlds, physical frontiers representing metaphysical transitions. These beliefs described entities capable of manipulation beyond conventional understanding, able to distort perception, create confusion, and mimic human characteristics without being human. My rational mind continued seeking conventional explanations. Extended isolation can induce paranoia and perceptual distortions. Sleep deprivation compromises cognitive function. Unknown individuals sometimes inhabit remote wilderness, developing territorial behaviors toward perceived intruders. Yet conventional explanations failed to address certain elements: the perfect voice mimicry, impossible track patterns, items moved while under direct observation. Some experiences defied rational categorization entirely. The psychological aftermath proved more persistent than anticipated. Sleep patterns remained disrupted by hypervigilance. Ordinary sounds, house settling, wind patterns, nocturnal wildlife, triggered disproportionate alertness responses. Peripheral movement registered as potential threat regardless of context. Physical evidence supported subjective experience. Photographs documented the arrangements found in forest: bone circles, symbolic configurations, deliberate positioning of natural elements into unnatural patterns. GPS data confirmed geographical anomalies, locations appearing differently on satellite imagery than when physically encountered. Most compelling, objects continuing to change position within my secured home. Keys relocated overnight despite doors remaining locked. Food items rearranged in precise patterns inside closed refrigerator. Muddy footprints appearing on floors recently cleaned, always partial, never complete enough to identify definitively. 3 weeks after returning, I contacted an anthropologist specializing in indigenous beliefs of the Southwest. Without revealing personal experience, I inquired about skinwalker legends and territorial entities described in local folklore. Her response proved simultaneously illuminating and disturbing. These traditions describe phenomena at intersection of physical and metaphysical reality. Modern interpretation dismisses them as superstition, but indigenous knowledge systems recognize permeable boundaries between worlds. Their protective protocols aren't based on superstition, but generations of accumulated observation. She explained purification rituals designed to break connections once established. Salt barriers around sleeping areas, specific botanical preparations burned at entryways, symbolic representations deliberately broken or dispersed. Most importantly, absolute refusal to acknowledge or directly name the entity once separated from its territory. The power lies in attention, she explained. These phenomena require acknowledgement to maintain connection. Refusing recognition eventually terminates the relationship. I implemented recommended protocols despite intellectual skepticism. Salt lines established around bed and doorways. Botanical elements positioned strategically throughout living space. Personal items rearranged to disrupt established patterns. The interventions produced immediate effect. Household disturbances decreased significantly within days. Sleep gradually normalized. Hypervigilance responses diminished to manageable levels. Two significant exceptions persisted. First, recurring dreams featuring forest environments never visited, but recognizably similar to Anasazi territory. These dreamscapes contained impossible architectural elements, structures that changed configuration when observed directly, pathways that connected discontinuous locations, organism classifications that combined multiple species characteristics simultaneously. Second, periodic discovery of small leather pouches identical to forest findings, appearing in previously searched locations within my home. Each contained different symbolic content but similar thematic elements. The appearances decreased in frequency but continued despite preventative measures. 6 weeks after returning, I encountered the elderly indigenous man from the forest unexpectedly, standing outside local grocery store as if waiting specifically for my arrival. His presence hundreds of miles from original meeting location defied probability. "It followed you," he stated without introduction. "I've implemented the protective measures," I replied. He nodded approval. "Good beginning, but connection remains active because you continue documenting experience." He gestured toward my phone containing photographic evidence and journal entries. "Attention sustains relationship. Documentation creates permanent pathways." "You're suggesting I delete everything? Pretend it never happened?" "Not denial. Completion." He handed me small fabric bundle containing unidentified botanical elements. "Burn these while deliberately concluding narrative. Establish endpoint in documentation and personal conception simultaneously. Then permanent separation becomes possible." His advice aligned with indigenous protocols previously researched, narrative conclusion as spiritual technology rather than mere psychological coping mechanism. I implemented his recommendation that evening, ceremonially burning provided elements while formally concluding written documentation. The ritual felt simultaneously ridiculous and profound. Conscious engagement with methodologies outside rational framework, yet potentially effective within alternative epistemological systems. The effects manifested immediately. Household disturbances ceased completely. Dream intrusions diminished significantly. The persistent sense of observation reduced to background awareness rather than forefront consciousness. Most significantly, leather pouches stopped appearing entirely. 2 months have now passed since forest encounter. Conventional functioning has largely resumed, though certain behavioral modifications persist. Reluctance towards solitary wilderness travel, hyper-awareness in natural settings, instinctive aversion to mimicry sounds regardless of source. The experience remains categorically unresolved. Empirical evidence supports subjective perception, yet contradicts conventional understanding of reality parameters. The phenomenon exists in liminal space between verifiable occurrence and psychological manifestation, simultaneously real and symbolic depending on interpretive framework applied. I've chosen pragmatic position. Absolute verification remains impossible, but potential consequences of dismissal outweigh benefits. I maintain protective protocols without requiring complete belief in their necessity. I acknowledge indigenous knowledge systems without abandoning critical thinking. Most importantly, I recognize boundaries between wilderness and civilization, known and unknown, physical and metaphysical. I respect these transitions rather than challenging their validity. The leather pouches remain secured in metal container, neither destroyed nor displayed. Their ambiguous status mirrors my own relationship with the experience, neither fully embraced nor rejected, but contained within boundaries established through deliberate limitation of attention. One certainty remains absolute. I will never return to those specific forests alone. What exists there, whether external entity or psychological projection, responds to observation with reciprocal interest. The exchange, once established, continues beyond geographical limitation unless deliberately terminated. Some boundaries exist specifically to separate incompatible realities. Crossing them creates consequences regardless of belief or intention. The watcher in the woods continues its vigilance. I've simply stopped looking back.